Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we have a fascinating story about a gentleman who was in a prestigious Bronx High School of Science and decided to move on to MIT, where he earned a PhD from Boston University and began a lucrative career as a clinical psychologist. Now, I'm sure you're probably wondering, well, I've heard that story many, many times, so what's the big deal? Well, eventually a person can become dissatisfied with a conventional life and decide to pursue a full-time spiritual path. Well, that particular journey led him to travel to South America, Andes, where he discovered something known as quinoa. Now, many of us know quite a bit about quinoa. It's become a very big-time main staple, especially in restaurants when it's served usually with seafood or chicken. But what if you were to discover that the person we're going to be talking with today was that who was probably primarily responsible for introducing it to the West here in the United States? That's exactly what we're going to be talking about today as we explore the Quinoa Chronicles, which is a memoir, and it's how a humble food from the high Andes became a worldwide sensation. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book, Stephen Gorad. Stephen, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Good morning, Daniel. It's great to be here.
Pretty exciting thing when you bring something like this and realize, it's funny about quinoa because it seems like it was something, and I've been in, let's say, the restaurant industry. It's only been in the last 15 to 20 years that it seems to be a real mainstay. Like you see it just about as frequently as rice served up with things, and it seems to have sort of that, what would we say, exotic flair to it. Tell us how all this started for it.
Yeah, well, my history with quinoa goes back, I think it's 35 years now. And it was introduced to me by, you got to get the picture. I'm kind of a young man, and I'm a young psychologist. And like you said, I was kind of dissatisfied with what traditional psychology had to offer. So I was looking elsewhere. So I was looking into spiritual teachers, teachers that dealt with subjects like consciousness. And I found this school. It was called Eureka, and the master of it was Oscar Ichazo. And my years with the school, that's a whole other story, a whole other program. But it turns out that Oscar Ichazo is from Bolivia, of all things. And just kind of maybe as an aside, he told us about some things that they have in Bolivia that we had never heard of. One, for example, was coffee berry tea, which is the Bolivians make a tea out of the husk, which is removed when they are actually going after the coffee bean. He told us about that, and he told us about quinoa. And he didn't say that much about it, except he was the master of the school, and whatever he said, it's like must be significant. So I think he said that it was something good to eat when you're doing spiritual practice. So that was the first time I ever heard of quinoa. And I also noticed that nobody that I knew had ever heard of it. So it's sort of like a uniquely Bolivian thing. And it kind of sat in the back of my mind really until I went on a trip to South America. And I talk about it in the book. The interesting thing to me about the trip is it never should have happened. It was like totally serendipitous. One event led to another event. I really had no interest in South America. My My spiritual leanings were toward the East, toward Buddhism. I had no great desire to travel in South America, but I did, and it was when I was in Bolivia. I found it in a marketplace, and I saw it. I didn't know what it was. It was like some unknown substance sitting in a bag, and I asked the Aymara woman, "What is this? ¿Qué es esto?" And she said, "Quinoa." And I goes like, "Oh, yeah, that's what Oscar Chazo talked about. I gotta get some," and I bought some. And I had no resources to cook it when I was traveling, but I went back to Chile when I was staying with a community of people. I cooked it. I watched it cook with the cover open, and I know if you've cooked it, you notice there's something kind of unusual about the way it looks. Watched it. I said, "Wow, this is really interesting." Also, I didn't really even know how to cook it, but I just said, "Okay, I'll cook it like brown rice, 2 parts water, 1 part grain." I cooked it, I ate it, and I fell in love with it. Daniel, I don't know how else to describe it. It just totally grabbed me. It fascinated me.
Right.
And at that point, I didn't know anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, and as I was mentioned at the beginning of the program, it's such a mainstay. It literally is like, I guess the best way I could describe it, especially in America, because they're so big on fads or, the taste of the day, if you will, is that what people don't realize about this, and it was really fascinating to read this, that in South America, I know it's primarily grown in, I believe it was Bolivia and Peru, as you were describing. And what I found fascinating is it was basically grown in small quantities for local villagers. Maybe once in a while they have some that would go to a city nearby or something like that. But it was really not a big deal. It was something that was really a local food. That's the first thing. And the other thing that I found unique was, especially in the beginning of your memoir, is that it seemed to be like a spirit food. Is that correct?
Spirit food?
Yeah, because you were into the meditation, and it seemed like how you got introduced to it. You need quinoa. I can't remember the gentleman who was talking to you about it, but it seemed to have sort of like a spiritual quality. Now, I'm stretching when I say this, like ayahuasca. At least that was the kind of read that I got. Not like that. But I meant sort of like in that realm, like quinoa. You really need to do this, not because of like what ayahuasca does, obviously, but like a spirit food, like a ginseng, if you will, or something like that.
Something, yeah.
Something.
Daniel, the one of the things that just fascinated me is that the situation that you're describing about how it was used in its home countries. It was even worse than that, because there's kind of like a class situation in South America. So the thing with quinoa is it was poor people's food. It was only eaten by the poor indigenous people. So in South America, the mixed blood, the Spanish invaded South America then, so there was Spanish blood mixed with Indian blood, and then even sort of like more pure European sort of people. Only the Indians ate it, and the sort of higher class people looked down upon it. They thought they considered it dirty. They wouldn't go near it. And we had that situation here in this country with peanuts, because peanuts were originally black slave food, and white people wouldn't touch it. And that obviously has changed. So that same thing happened in South America. It was so they thought of it. Most people thought of it as chicken feed. And when I went there, you couldn't find it in a restaurant. You couldn't find it in it was never like packaged and sold in a food shop. It was only found in the indigenous markets. So you think about that. It's grown by small farmers on small plots of land. These are poor people with very little infrastructure to do very much. Just think about how the hell did we actually get it to the point where we could import it and sell it in the United States. So one of the things, I was thinking about what to talk to you about quinoa, and the word that it kept popping up in my head was miracle. That quinoa as a food is a miracle. As a plant, it's a miracle. But it's also a miracle that we were able to do what we did, and that quinoa is as popular as it is now. And by the way, I think quinoa kind of got. We started selling it the company started in 1983, so quinoa has been available, but it's only, I'd say, in the last 10, 15 years that it's become as popular as it is now. But it's kind of still like an in food, like a fad. I don't think people really know very much about it, except everybody's eating it. It's people are creating recipes with it and new ways to use it and stuff. So, but in my mind, it's not that. In my mind, it's a basic, real food, like a staple food, like rice and like wheat. And we're only in really the beginning stages of its history, and there's a lot more that's going to happen with quinoa because of some of its properties and because of things that are happening on the planet with climate change and things of that nature.
So now, how adaptable is quinoa to be able to be grown in other places other than where you first found it?
Very, very good question. Because in fact, when I started working with quinoa, I also had the thought, why me? Why hasn't someone done this before? So in my research, I found that other people had tried it. The Rodale people in Pennsylvania, they put out products. They have Prevention Magazine and other publications, and they brought quinoa to the United States before us, and they also brought amaranth. They were researching, looking for new, possible, interesting crops. And they tried to grow amaranth, they tried to grow quinoa. Quinoa failed. And because their crop failed, they decided they weren't going to promote it. And they put all of their energy behind amaranth. So back then, the thought that one would import quinoa for sale in the United States nobody thought that was possible. So the idea was we have to grow it here. And it failed. In the literature, there were other attempts as well, and it failed. The part of why I say what we did was miraculous was that our first attempt to grow it, and we grew it in Colorado. And again, in the book, there's a little story about how I traded the shirt off my back for a bag of seed. Well, that seed I brought back to the States, gave it to my buddy Don, gave it to the person that became our third partner, David Cusack, and we planted it, and it succeeded. It grew, and that, if it hadn't succeeded, we never would have done anything with quinoa. But it succeeded that year. So just at the right time, that year that we needed the encouragement to continue, we got it. But the next year was not so good, and the following year was not so good. So quinoa is dicey. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. However, with time, experimentation, and experience, it's now being grown almost all over the world. They found, first of all, we talked about quinoa coming from Bolivia and Peru. Quinoa actually grows all along the Andes Mountains. So it also grows in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. So if you just think about all the diversity of areas, and that also means diversity of soil type, of rainfall, of temperature, of things like day length. There are varieties that have very different characteristics depending upon where it came from originally. And someone estimated there were about 2,000 different varieties of quinoa. I think there's probably more. Basically, like we said before, quinoa was something grown by a small farmer on his small plot of land. So he's got his farm on the west side of a particular mountain at a certain elevation with certain rainfall. So his quinoa is going to be different from a guy growing it on the other side of the mountain. So and he's going to grow the same quinoa year after year after year after year. So there's like all of this fantastic genetic diversity of quinoa. Quinoa grows it grows high on the Altiplano, which is a flat plain in Bolivia and Peru. And we're talking high, we're talking 14,000 feet high. It's basically a desert. But there are quinoas that grow in mountain valleys, so at lower altitudes, like 8,000 feet. And then this is highly significant. There's one variety of quinoa that grows at sea level, and that's a variety that grows in Chile. And it's that variety that is mostly responsible for the spread of quinoa around the world, because the quinoa that grows at sea level is better adapted to the kinds of areas where people would grow quinoa, say in China or France or Canada. Canada has there are some good people in Canada. They call their quinoa, I think they call it Teeny Hero, and it's derived from the Chilean quinoa. And the Chilean quinoa, if you saw it, it's different. It's different from the quinoa that you're going to buy here in Costco. It's smaller, it's darker, and when you cook it, it's sort of, sticky rice. The Chinese use sticky rice for like sweet rice dishes. It's like sticky quinoa. It kind of clumps together more. It's not the kind of light, fluffy quinoa that most of us know about. And there are even other aspects of different kinds of quinoa that make it appropriate for certain uses. So, but the process that happens in agriculture is you take a seed from somewhere, you grow it, you've got a field of quinoa, and maybe only 10% of it works. The rest of it dies out. You save the seed that works, and then you plant that next season, and then you have a better chance of having a seed that will work in that particular place. And
so it becomes a very highly adaptable plant, it sounds like, but through generations.
With time, with time and experimentation, I believe you could grow quinoa anywhere if you had the right genetic stock to start with, and then doing hybrids. So I mean, the traditional way of hybrids it has nothing to do with genetic modification. It's just plant breeding. That happens with all crops. So they're hybridizing. They're crossing one variety with another to get the characteristics that make it best adaptable to a particular place. But also, the genetic scientists are fascinated with quinoa. And, okay, so picture this. The Arabian Peninsula, let's say Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, they've got this desert land, and one of the problems, aside from water with desert land, is its high salt content. Daniel, guess what? Quinoa, some quinoas are highly salt tolerant. Almost all quinoas are drought tolerant. So they're experimenting with planting quinoa in the Arabian desert.
Wow.
But also the genetic scientists are trying to find the gene in quinoa that gives it salt tolerance, and they want to put it in corn to make corn salt tolerant. So their vision is they're going to grow corn on the Arabian Peninsula.
Well, how about that?
I mean, some people may not like that, but I'm just saying it because it's going to happen, because there are people working on it. So salt tolerance, drought tolerance, frost tolerance are the three aspects of quinoa that that the scientists are excited about. They want those characteristics in other plants. So that's why I say quinoa. The kind of the life cycle of quinoa it's just beginning. It's going to be everywhere. It's going to be a commodity. I say it in the book. I had by the way, this book, it's like, I don't know if I'm coming across like I'm hyping it or I'm...
No, not at all. I think it's
unrealistic.
something that people really need to be aware of the journey of it, first of all, and what's going on here.
Yeah, but I swear to you that everything in the book is true. It's like I'm not. I don't deal well with fantasy or.
Mm-hmm.
It's like my enthusiasm for quinoa is based on reality. And then I go and I say something like, I think it's a miracle. I can't help it. I do. It's like there's no other plant like it. I picture the so-called best quinoa. It's called Quinoa Real, which in Spanish would be royal quinoa. So the best quinoa, and part of why it's the best is it's the biggest, whitest grain. Nutritionally, I don't know that it's all that different from the other quinoas. But this best quinoa, Quinoa Real, grows on the Altiplano, so we're talking 14,000 feet. On the Altiplano, there's an area called the Salar de Uyuni. It's a gigantic salt lake, which they're now taking lithium out of that. But quinoa, on the southern shores of this salt lake, that's where the best quinoa grows. Just think about it. It's like high altitude. High altitude means the air is thin. There's very little oxygen. The air is cold at high altitudes, but the sun is really strong. So I don't know. You look at pictures of the indigenous peoples, and their bodies, they're on the short side, sort of short, stocky side, and that's partially because their circulatory systems are built to be able to survive with less oxygen in the air, and they're dark-skinned, but also, they're kind of like their cheeks get burnt. It's like the sun is unbearably hot, so everyone wears a hat, but the air is cold, and you notice that it's like you're walking around in the sun, you feel warm, you go in the shade and immediately it's cold, and the water is like really cold. So anyway, this area where the best quinoa grows, rainfall, forget it. There's so little rainfall. The way they plant the quinoa there is they dig a hole in and the soil, by the way, it's not like farmland. It's not like black, rich soil. It's sand. It's desert. They dig a hole and they put the seeds in the bottom of the hole, and they dig the hole to reach what might be left of moisture from the previous year. And then they kind of hope and pray that the quinoa is going to get enough water out of there to start growing. You look at pictures that, it's things are changing now, because quinoa is now a crop. They can make money. The farming practices have changed. And those dirt poor farmers, they're making money, which is really, really good. I'm happy about that. The frost at that altitude, you could have frost many times during the season, particularly at night. People that have gardens here know the growing season ends when frost comes. That's the signal that season's over. Because frost comes, your tomato plants are dead. Every plant dies. Quinoa doesn't die. The quinoa plant will live through a frost. It will live through a drought. It survives with this intense solar radiation. I don't know any other plant that is as strong as that. And also, you go up on the altiplano, you look around, there are no trees. There's nothing up there because nothing grows. Quinoa grows. It's got that kind of vitality. And you know what? You can. This is like back in the early days when I was first working with quinoa, and I'm thinking like, let's see. Okay, we've got the quinoa grain. You can eat it like rice. Could grind it into flour and bake with it. And I'm thinking like, well, how about sprouts? Back then, people were really into sprouts, alfalfa sprouts. They were sprouting everything. Actually, they still do. I notice. So I sprouted quinoa. By the way, they taste awful. Don't do it. But anyone that grows sprouts knows you grow the sprouts to the length that you want, and when you want it to stop, you put it in the refrigerator. You put the alfalfa sprouts in the refrigerator, they stop growing. So I grew the quinoa sprouts, I put it in the refrigerator. Guess what? It didn't stop growing. It's like there's no other plant like it. I don't know. The thing about the vitality of the grain, quinoa is like this nugget that's just like can't wait to grow. So, germination. You take quinoa, you put it in a glass of water. It'll sprout in less than 4 hours. You do the same thing with wheat. It takes 12 hours. It's like quinoa is like the grain, which is the thing that we're eating, is like it's like bursting with energy. It's just ready to grow. By the way, I don't know why I wrote this book. I wrote it and thinking like, well, what, why did I do this? It's like I wrote it as a memoir because I didn't know how else to write. I didn't want to write a textbook. I wanted to write something kind of with a human story that might be more interesting. So it's kind of like a book about me. But then I started getting feedback from people that read it, and they said, you know what, Steve, I really get quinoa now, and I'm eating it much more than I did before. And I never thought that this might be a consequence of the book. And then it dawned on me, oh yeah, I'm still doing the same thing I've been doing for years. I'm promoting quinoa. I'm still trying to get people to understand what quinoa is and to maybe to love it as much as I do.
Now, if you were to describe quinoa to someone, like a good short description if possible, what would you say about quinoa so that they think, I want to pursue this, or I'm very interested in this? What about quinoa makes it special, besides what we've talked about, like adaptability, its uniqueness, things like that?
Well, it depends upon what the person's interest is. So if they were like a food person, I might talk about how versatile it is in cooking. Quinoa, by the way, this is one of my pet peeves. Is everywhere I look, people are saying quinoa is not a grain; it's a seed, and it's like I'm going like, what? It's like that. It's like that doesn't even make logical sense because all grains are seeds. It's like it's not a useful distinction anyway. Quinoa is a grain. Grains are we use them in different ways. We use different grains in different ways. So, for example, like when you say rice, what's the first thing you think of? You think of like a bowl of rice.
Right.
It's like maybe a side dish or something like that. When you say wheat, the first thing you think about is, bread or maybe pasta. But, you could eat wheat the same way you eat rice. You could cook it like rice, and you could eat a bowl of wheat. So rice has its own kind of traditional way of use. Wheat has its own. Barley, well, where do you see barley? Barley, beer. Barley is another grain. They make beer out of it. Or I see it in soup. Rye. Well, rye. Rye bread. Nobody eats a bowl of rye. Or nobody, they make whiskey out of rye, but they don't make beer out of rye. By the way, someone made whiskey out of quinoa. Okay, my point is because quinoa is sort of like new to all of us, it doesn't come along with like a fixed way to use it. So my message is that quinoa can be used in all of those ways. So you can eat it like a bowl of quinoa. You can any way you use rice, you could use quinoa. But you can grind it into flour, and you can bake with it. In fact, just before we started, I was eating a piece of quinoa cake. There's a recipe in the book. I think I put a recipe for quinoa chocolate cake. But this time I made a lemon poppy quinoa cake. And no wheat flour. It's all quinoa, and I used a little almond flour. But it was the most delicious cake. You can bake with it. You can bake bread with it.
Wow.
Oh, Daniel, pancakes.
There you go.
If you think about if you think what, you love pancakes?
Well, no, I was just saying, there you go. This is not only adaptable where you can grow it, but it's also very adaptable for its uses.
How you use it, exactly. Pancakes, kind of like it's like, why is one pancake better than another pancake? Well, one of the things is you want it to be light. You don't want like a heavy, doughy, thick pancake. You want like a light, fluffy pancake. Well, when you cook quinoa, you see how light how light it is. It's a very light grain, to eat. You just take a spoonful of quinoa. It's very light. So lightness is a characteristic of quinoa. You make pancakes out of it, you get the most light, delicious, fluffy pancakes. And I don't think too many people know that.
Oh.
So also, you can make beer out of it. I think that's happened. I know there's a whiskey made out of it. You can definitely put it in soups like barley. They're using it for sushi. The ways that it can be used are limited only by the creative impulses of the person who's cooking it.
How about nutritionally? How do you see or view, or how would you describe, let's say, because everybody's really big on nutritional value, and of course in America when that happens, it's more is better kind of a thing. But what about the nutritional value of quinoa?
Okay, so dial the calendar back. I'm in that apartment in Chile. I cooked quinoa. I fell in love with it. And then I'm going like, why? But I don't know anything about it. What do I, what is it? What is this? So I asked my Chilean friends, and the one that responded was Paz, who I also fell in love with and later married. And I lost her. 2016, she passed away. But anyway, she got me a scientific paper written by a Chilean scientist. His name was Ingo Junge, and in it he describes the nutritional qualities of quinoa. I read that, and I couldn't believe it. So the thing that jumped out at me, and still is highly significant, is the protein. So quinoa, and like I told you, there are many different varieties of quinoa. So depending upon which quinoa they test, you're going to get a different result. But the range from all the various tests done by scientists, the percentage of protein went from range from 11% to 21%. And so when I talk about quinoa, I say it has the average would be 16%. So quinoa has more protein than any other grain. Now, mind you, you don't kind of think about grains as sources of protein. People tend to think more in terms of legumes, of beans, so particularly like soy. So soy has more protein. Soy, I believe, is up close to 50% protein. Quinoa, I'm saying, is 16%, as high as 21%. But there's a big difference. It's the quality of the protein. So quinoa, and what do I mean by quality of protein? Well, actually, they rate proteins according to quality. And the quality has to do with whether it has the 9 essential amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Our body actually manufactures amino acids, but there are 9 of them that the body can't make, which means that we have to take those amino acids in with our food. So those are called essential amino acids. Quinoa has all of them. Soy doesn't. The other grains don't. the grains tend to be missing the amino acid called lysine. Soy and the other beans tend to be low in what are called the sulfur-bearing amino acids, methionine and cysteine. Quinoa has all of them. Okay, one more thing, and this is a determination done by FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. They plotted the relative percentages of the 9 essential amino acids that the body needs. So it's sort of like the ideal pattern of amino acid composition for best use by the body. And it turns out that the protein sources that are best adapted for use for the human body are albumin, which is egg white, and casein, which is the protein in milk. Daniel, guess what? Quinoa has the same amino acid pattern as milk and eggs.
Wow.
And it's from a plant.
This
is not true of any other plant source of quinoa. So quinoa protein quantity is very respectable, but the quality is unbelievable.
Wow, such a fascinating journey, and I know people really enjoy your book. It's it's a lot of fun. It's very quirky in some respects. You know, when you read this and realize the journey. I know. But it's fun. That's what makes it. You're like, I didn't know that much about quinoa. The next time, you know, you can see sitting down at dinner and somebody decides to well, what is quinoa? Well, you know, I have an interesting story that you should hear about. And I like that. But you know,
you'll have a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say it reminds me, there was someone I know, and this was years ago, and he worked in a restaurant. He was actually like a manager, but it was a family-owned restaurant, high-end kind of a place. And they had tableside service, and what he really enjoyed doing, and this was reasons people would come back, is that, you know, they had things there like Bananas Foster, Steak Diane, whatever the case is. And he would actually tell the story about what these things were. You know, that Bananas Foster was named after a guy that became a governor who was a health inspector, for instance. You know, or Steak Diane's been a recipe around for 400 years. And I think that when people can begin to make a connection with food, I mean, this day and age, we're tearing food apart. You know, we're looking at its elements, nutritional values. You know, you're hearing all this crap and seeing it on TV, and I'm thinking, whatever happened to the true romance of what food is? Food should be an aphrodisiac as far as, you know, seducing you to living, as far as I'm concerned. And this is one of those books, which is the Quinoa Chronicles we're talking about here today. Our guest, Stephen Gorad. You know, this is one of those things where you become, you know, just enraptured by it. It's a lot of fun to read.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for saying that. You know, to be frank, it's like, I wrote the book. It's not. I'm not making a career as an author.
No.
I'm not particularly promoting it. I mean, I don't even know how to promote it. You know, so it's like I'm thinking, I did the book, but people should read the book.
Right.
So I think. I really appreciate you having me on. This is actually, I did one short radio interview before, and this is really the only one that really got into any substance. And
we like doing that here on the program, stories.
Good for you. I looked at the programs you do. You do fascinating stuff. You really do. I want to thank you.
Well, and it was something that I liked doing years ago. I realized, there are so many fascinating people out there, not the ones you see on television or you read about in magazines, but true people out there that you never know who you're standing next to till you strike up a conversation. You ask a good few questions, get them to talk about themselves, and realize, man, I'm standing next to the NASA engineer that was involved with the Apollo 13 project. Really?
Exactly.
And, and I couldn't help myself at moments as you were describing quinoa and your South American trips and, how this is such an adaptable plant. All of a sudden, Wade Davis came to mind, and he's an anthropologist who people might know from The Serpent and the Rainbow. He's the one that goes out and he studies and is involved with indigenous cultures around the world. And, well, one of the fascinating things that he talked about is a concern about the rubber tree, and how this is a tree that just pops up here and there throughout the forest to avoid blight, and how we tried to culturalize and agriculturalize, that is, this particular tree so that we can make rubber for our tires. And they finally found a way to do this where this tree didn't get blighted. In other words, it's sort of like a mold, if you will, that kills the tree. And then they abandoned the project after World War II was over and things like that. And so I was thinking about quinoa, and you were talking that we get to this point where we start doing the same thing. Look at corn, for instance. We found a way to turn this into a concern about, for instance, Monsanto and I'm trying to think of the right word here, inorganic, what do they call that? It's the big key word today everybody seems to be concerned about.
What, GMO?
Yeah, GMO, that's what I was trying to think of there. And when you were talking about how they're infusing this quinoa into corn, I thought to myself, they're finding a natural way to make not only corn healthier, but to be able to grow it out in Saudi Arabia, for crying out loud. Are we moving to a point where we're starting to see the chemical companies fading away because we can actually, or nature, should we say, can find a better way to do this that's good for everything?
Yes,
so.
yes.
And so you see my track and thinking as you were describing all that was like, wow, there's quite a bit here. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
There's a guy I encountered at a quinoa conference that he's a strange guy. He's a beautiful guy. He travels around the world. His only interest is in plants that can be used for food, and he's cataloging them. And I think he's coming out with a book fairly soon. His name is Joseph Simcox. You might look him up and maybe invite him. I think, as far as I'm concerned, he's kind of the adventurer pioneer that's finding new food sources. And by the way, there are thousands of them. There's so many foods out there that we don't know about. Quinoa could have been, it could have remained obscure,
right?
And we wouldn't have this conversation. But again, I'll say the word miracle. It's a miracle that we got to do what we did, and that quinoa is really blossomed out there, and is that it's starting its journey into use throughout the planet. Simcox can tell you about other stuff. I see his stuff mostly on Facebook if you want to look.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you've come across him, certainly point him in our direction. It would be a lot of fun to have someone like him on the program, just as much fun as it's been having you on the program, Stephen.
Oh, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
Now, is there a website our listeners can go to find out more about your work, maybe how they can get the book, find out the story, things like that?
Well, you write a book, you got to have a website. So there is a website called QuinoaChronicles.com. And there's some, well, I guess there's more information. There's some photos. And there are links to buying. Well, you can, if you want to buy the book, you can buy it directly from Amazon. It's at Amazon. At my website, there's a link to Amazon, but there's also a link. I made an ebook, and I put extra photos in it, and I put the photos in color, and that's available from the website. There's a Kindle version, but it's in black and white. That's also available from Amazon. And on Facebook, I have a Facebook page that I started years ago. It's just called Quinoa World.
Oh.
And in Quinoa World, I try and post recent news about quinoa. So, for example, the Prime Minister of Malaysia got in trouble because he said he prefers quinoa to rice.
Oh, boy.
And they attacked him politically. You know, it's like in Malaysia they eat rice. You know, he said he likes quinoa, but so little news stories. I put links to things like the Bolivian harvest just came in, and there's some links to pictures of that, and also recipes. I also put a lot of recipes, and I put stuff on there just about every week. So that's Facebook. It's called Quinoa World.
So we have Quinoa World, Quinoa Chronicles.com. We also have the book, the Quinoa Chronicles memoir. And so you've got it all right there in front of you, so that way you know the story and it's not just going to be a fad on your kitchen table. Stephen, thank you for being on the program today. It's been a pleasure.
Daniel, thank you so much. Have a great day. And
a great
life.
Oh, always. Thank you so much. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.